Good afternoon. My name is Joe Rowan, and I'm with the Fort Collins Chamber of Commerce, your MC for this afternoon for the NoCo Housing Now Summit. Welcoming back those of you who were able to join for the morning session on healthcare, and welcome to those of you who are joining us for this discussion, which will revolve around housing and how it intersects with healthcare. And I'd like to start off by, first of all, thanking our gold sponsor for NoCo Housing Now, Kaiser Permanente. And it's with their support we're able to produce this event and the quarterly events that will occur, that do occur through NoCo Housing Now. You'll see the Kaiser's logo in the addition to our Healthcare for Your Future Summit sponsors logo on the screen. And just a reminder that all materials from today will be posted on our event website, and that will be posted for you to review, as well as an email that will go out post event that will include links to all the material you're seeing today. But before we get started, I'd like to open up the mic to Summer Garcia with United Way of Weld County, who would like to share some very good news from the Northern Colorado Continuum of Care. NoCo CFC is a coalition of service providers and local public agencies tasked with addressing homelessness and its effect on residents across the region. Summer, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, like Joe said, my name is Summer Garcia. I work for United Way of Weld County, but I am the CAPS coordinator for the Northern Colorado Continuum of Care. And that is the name that we gave our coordinated entry system. You may or may not know, we did set a goal to end veteran homelessness or reach our functional zero, which is 8. So meaning once our list is down to 8 veterans, we have reached our functional zero. While that is still our goal, we started a Home for the Holidays campaign where we have set another goal to house 50 veterans in 100 days for our final push, because I wanted to let you guys know we have right now on our list, we only have 46 veterans that are identified veterans. 38 of those 46 have a housing resource, and they are working with a case manager, whether that be from the VA or Volunteers of America. They are working with a case manager to secure housing. 8 of those 46 do not have a resource, but they have been contacted by a veteran resource or veteran service. And so we're hoping that with this final push and with this Home for the Holidays campaign in the next few months, we are able to have a significant portion of our by name list so that we can reach our functional zero, which is 8. And that's really what I wanted to announce. So if you know of a landlord or housing resource, because really I believe we have the funds, we have the things that we need to get veterans housed. We just need some housing and landlords to help us out. That's really what I wanted to say today.
Thank you so much, Summer. Great news, great progress you're being made in that regard, and I'm sure we all look forward to hearing the final count later this year. So now on behalf of the Fort Collins Chamber, I'm pleased to introduce our first presentation from Dr. Phyliss Resnick and Jennifer Newcomer. Dr. Phyliss Resnick is the Executive Director and Chief Economist at the Colorado Future Center at Colorado State University. And Jennifer Newcomer is the Research Director for the Colorado Future Center at CSU. And the Colorado Future Center is a 501c3 dedicated to informing about economic, fiscal, and public policy issues impacting community and economic health and quality of life. And Dr. Resnick leads the center's work on macro and fiscal forecasting, the fiscal sustainability of state and local government, and the impacts of tax and expenditure limitations. She also supports the center's expanded research portfolio, focusing on all aspects of family economic security and community economic health. I'm also pleased to introduce Jennifer Newcomer, who is, I believe, will be substituting for Dr. Resnick unless she's able to join us. As I understand, she's checking in from Morocco. So, Jennifer, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you and Phyliss, if she's able to join us, take it from here.
Thank you, Joe. Actually, I will turn it over to Phyliss. It seems we have a stable connection for her, so she will take it away from here. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so as Joe, you teed up for me, I was going to say I am joining from a small village in Morocco. It's almost 9 o'clock at night here. And Jen and I tested a Zoom call, and the Wi-Fi connection seems stable, but if I have a problem, she's on deck to take over seamlessly from me. But I will go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully we will be successful. So yeah, thank you for inviting us. It's always delightful for us to get up in Northern Colorado, because as Joe mentioned, our research center has a CSU affiliation that's been a really nice partner for us for many years now. But we're located in, we're attached to the university at the system level. So we're still located down in Denver, but we always enjoy getting to get up north. I guess today we're not exactly up north. I'm quite a bit east. And, you know, share our research around the state. So it's really a delight for us to be with you tonight. As Joe also mentioned, the Colorado Future Center is a center that's actually been around in the state for about almost 15 years now. We had a DU affiliation earlier than a CSU affiliation. At that time, we did mostly macro fiscal work. But when I became the director, I felt very strongly that we needed to expand our work into issues around family economic security. And I've had a long running professional and very nice friendship with Jennifer, and I convinced her to take the leap and come over and join us and bring a research portfolio that she worked on for many years at the Piton Foundation around family economic security and opportunity. And what we're going to share with you tonight, this afternoon for you, is a portion of that body of work that we've worked on together since Jen has joined the center. I was back in the days that we can hardly remember before COVID. I was actually up at, I think, the conference that immediately preceded this one, and talked about a body of work that Jen and I had completed around housing. And the wheel that I have up here on this slide may be familiar for those of you who joined us a couple of years ago. And it is sort of indicative of sort of this omnibus study that Jen and I completed, looking at factors impacting affordability of housing in the state. And we came away from that hoping that leaders and residents and other interested parties in the state would understand that housing is a complex issue. You can't just blame it on or blame unaffordability on construction defects, which for a while is what we were doing. You can't only point to labor shortages. You can't only point to regulation. It's really this ecosystem of everything associated with housing that has collided to leave us in the situation where we are. And so that study, unfortunately, I forgot to put the link to it in the slide I have at the end with the link to the other studies I'm going to be sharing today. But that study is also available on our website. And if you can't find it, feel free to contact us. It's getting a little bit dated this time, but we're pretty happy to announce that in the next 6 months, we are hopefully going to secure some funding to update it, because clearly the affordability problem has not gone away. But what I'm going to share today is some research that study kind of spawned, because we came away from that study thinking, at the end of the day, it's a supply and demand problem. And I'll hope you'll indulge me in being an economist and claiming that the whole world looks like a supply and demand problem. But we really did come away thinking that, a big part of the problem with housing is that there's too much demand and not enough supply. And so or Coloradans are looking for ways to navigate around that. So the first part of what I'm going to share with you is one strategy that we believe Coloradans are using to deal with the fact that the relatively short supply relative to demand is leaving us with, highly inflated housing prices. And then we're going to turn to a bit more of a hopeful note and share with you some work we did through a engagement with an organization called the Lincoln Institute, looking at an opportunity for alternative means of providing supply. And thirdly, I'm going to share some research we did related to COVID and housing that, again, is getting a little bit dated, but we think is still very germane since the pandemic has not left us yet. So the first thing is the strategy that we believe Coloradans are using. And one of the things that we feel very strongly about as we look at the numbers and we do our research is that doubling up as a strategy to afford housing has become increasingly prevalent. Currently in Colorado, there's about 470,000 households that are doubled up, and those are doubled up family households. And I'll explain what I mean by that. And 210,000 non-family households for a total of about 580,000 households where we would define doubling up happening. And what we mean by doubling up is that there's someone living in your house who's not a part of your nuclear family. So a doubled up family household might be that you have your parent living with you. So you have three generations, a grandparent, a parent, and children. It could be you have a niece. You have your sister and her full nuclear family living with you. But the people in the household who are doubled up are related familiarly to you. The non-doubled up households are the most common form of that is what you would think of, which is a roommate situation. Probably very prevalent in Fort Collins because it's a university town, same thing in Boulder. But we're seeing more and more of that as well that is outside of the places where it would be kind of a student situation. There's a little bit of that happening in the urban areas as young folks come to Denver, perhaps for their first job and get a roommate. We probably all did that. But we're seeing growth in all aspects of doubling up. And this is indicative of that growth. In 2006, the first time we looked at these numbers, about 20% of Colorado households were doubled up. Jump ahead to 2017, about 25%. And between 2017 and 2019, we went from 25 to almost 30% of households that are doubling up. And so we're seeing this become an increasingly important strategy that Coloradans are using. I just realized that I'm not in slide mode, so I'm going to move forward this way. We were curious about who these households were, and I actually found this surprising. I would have expected that more of this phenomena was happening in renter households than in owner households, but in fact, it's exactly the opposite. By tenure, the majority of the doubled up households in the state are with owners. So it's a family or a person who owns a home and is taking someone else in to live with them, whether that's for economic reasons or for other reasons. But it is not what you would think that the overwhelming majority of that is with renters. A lot of our state's children are living this way. 20% of the children under 6 years old in the state of Colorado are living in doubled up households. 25% of the children under 19 are living in doubled up households. And then about 20% of our households are now taking in a senior, probably in many cases a family member, to live with them. And I suspect we will see that grow as time goes by, because as we have the baby boom, age out of their working years and age into their retirement years, it would not surprise me to see more and more of those become multi-generational households. We like to focus on children at the center because we feel like children, to some extent, are among the most vulnerable in our population. And 50% of those doubled up children are actually living in these households and also with a single parent. And then the other half are either living in a partnership situation or a married family that has then taken on some other member of the household. And 4 in 10 of those children are living with a grandparent present. Now, some of that may not be for economic reasons. Some of that could be for family reasons. Some of that could be because there's care being given to the older member of the family. Some of that could be that grandparents are living in the household to help ease the child care burden. But we're seeing quite a few children in the state living in doubled up situations. Here's a heat map of what it looks like. And, that sort of area where you all are sitting today is dark green, not surprising because we have a university there. We see the same in Boulder, but you can see that this is much more of a common occurrence in sort of the Northwest, Northeast, and in the sort of central I-25 corridor than in the southern part of the state or the southwest part of the state. So then we got curious about how things had changed since we did our first study on this. I think when I was in Fort Collins or Loveland a couple years ago sharing our preliminary research on this, I had some early numbers, but we've now done an update. So while the majority of the households who are doubled up are family households, the majority of the growth is happening in that non-family category. So family households are growing by about 50%. In terms of those who are doubled up, but the amount of non-family households who are doubled up has almost doubled between 2017 and 2019. And this, I think, is probably the most compelling graphic of our work in the doubled up research that we've done. And let me try and explain this because it took me a little while to wrap my head around this. I will read the title. I don't usually read my titles, but I'll read it and then I'll talk about it. There are fewer young children, so under 5, living in non-doubled households in 2019 than there were in 2006. So that doesn't mean that there hasn't been any births of children in non-doubled up households, but it means if we looked at the number of children under 5 in 2006 living in a household that was not doubled up, there are fewer of those children in 2019 than there were in 2006. So all of the growth in children under the age of 5 between 2006 and 2019 is happening to people who are living in households that are doubled up. And Jen and I scratched our head around that for a long time, but that's a fairly compelling finding and that has led us to believe that this is really largely or to a strong extent driven by economic stress that's causing that to happen. So we got curious about that issue of economic stress, and we went and looked at the relationship between jobs in the state and housing. And it turns out, I'm going to draw your attention to the graph that has the bar that has the 50% at the top, that 50% of the jobs in Colorado are in occupations that require more than 2 jobs to support a median income house. And so given that, it's not hard to understand why people are doubling up, because if you need more than 2 jobs to afford a house, you need a third person who's earning to be able to come into that household and make the economics work. So we're increasingly convinced that doubling up has become a strategy that Coloradans are using to deal with the fact that housing has become increasingly cost stressful. And so we were looking for a more hopeful aspect to this. And we were lucky enough, as I mentioned, to get support from the Lincoln Institute to look at a case study of an organization or a company that has recently opened a factory in Pueblo called IndieDwell. And IndieDwell is building modular housing. They started off building with shipping containers and they've moved on. And we were curious about what made that work. And what we found in our case study is there was sort of this constellation of players that came together in order to make it viable for IndieDwell to locate in Pueblo. I should mention that not only are they developing affordable housing, but they are also providing jobs that are very viable and are carrying wages that are able to support housing in the community. So it's an interesting job creation and housing model. And we have this sort of schematic of what had to come together. There was a very strong philanthropic level of support, particularly from the Colorado Health Foundation, which you may hear about a little bit after I finish. Jen and I would like to believe that our research at the Research Center supported the philanthropic community in their belief that it was important to come in and support alternative ways of developing housing. The city of Pueblo was delighted to have the opportunity to work with IndieDwell because, as I mentioned, it had an economic development and job creation component. And then probably as the smallest partner, government had to come in with some help with the notion of modular housing and also with perhaps some help with the regulations about what was necessary in order to have a modular house get approved for use in the state. And so we came up with a series of hypotheses. I won't read all these to you, you'll have them, but we like to believe that our research mattered, that proving that there was a problem. The one that's probably turned out to be the most important was the notion that philanthropic support could come in and really make these deals work, that it required a local champion to move the process through, that it required a little bit of a beginning of the change of perception about modular housing, and that all of those had to come together. And when we went and did our case study, we basically found that that we were fairly correct in our hypotheses, that each one of those hypotheses that we proposed turned out to be supported by the case of IndieDwell. And so we're hopeful that our research, which is also available in this case on the Lincoln Institute site, but you could link from ours, sort of lays out a model that could be replicated to support an alternative means of providing housing supply in the state. And like all good researchers, we wanted to sort of look back and sort of see what our key learnings were. And the one that I would point to the most is sort of the combination of 1 and 2, I suppose, that I think we were less focused on how important that alternative means of capital that came from the Health Foundation and other partners really was. And it led us to believe that not only do we need to have some sort of disruption in our notion of the way you build a house, Jen and I often laugh when we did our first housing study. We said, we were talking to one of the folks we interviewed who said, go have a look at a job site when they're building a house and it won't look very different than it did 50 or 60 years ago. It's a bunch of people standing around banging on things. And while we've had enormous productivity improvements in other industries, think agriculture or advanced manufacturing, we haven't really seen that in construction, particularly housing. And so we were very focused on the need to disrupt the production process and not as focused on the need to disrupt the financing side. And I think our key learning out of this is that it takes both to find these alternative means, that at least early on when you're being innovated, that the traditional forms of capital might not necessarily be willing to jump in, but philanthropic capital can go a long way to make something like IndieDwell viable and happen. So we left this case study quite hopeful. And then, of course, we had a pandemic. And we started to get concerned about, what it's going to mean for housing stability, especially for those who are very adversely affected from an employment perspective during the pandemic. And this work is getting a little bit dated now. We haven't gone ahead and updated it, but we looked kind of 3 or 4 months after the beginning of the pandemic and kind of had a look at which industries were essentially the most adversely affected. And you see them listed here. I'll focus your attention on accommodations and food service because it's the only one that has not fully recovered. And we were concerned more than curious, but concerned also about the viability of people who were working in those industries and who they were. Statewide, before the pandemic, there were about 808,000 people working in those four industries. They were living in 654,000 households across the state. And those are the ones who were already vulnerable, meaning that they were already housing cost burden prior to COVID. They had under $75,000 a year of household income. And again, they were pretty evenly distributed between renters and owners. So it wasn't just sitting in one category or the other. I always get concerned about cutoffs that are as extreme as 30% because you could be 29.8% and we would miss you. So I wanted to put a little margin around that. And if we add a margin of those who are 25 to 29% cost burden, we pick up another 104,000 households with 155,000 workers in those categories. Now, admittedly, because we have industries in there like accommodations and food service, some of those workers are not full-time workers in those jobs. You know, you could have a 17-year-old daughter or son who's working at Chipotle and supporting him or herself through perhaps the last year of high school. So we looked more closely at that same set of criteria, but we took out anyone who was under 18 years old. And when we did that, we found that there were 406,000 and change households statewide who had 517,000 workers who were attached to those four affected industries. They weren't necessarily cost burdened. I will talk about that in a moment. But those households are certainly vulnerable during COVID because a lot of those jobs became vulnerable. And those households, you see our little highlights here. The majority of them were with female workers. As we've heard over and over again, this recession has hit females a lot harder than it's hit males. They're largely living in rental housing, which also makes them more vulnerable to eviction. Certainly, the enormous and unprecedented amount of federal and state support that came in has kind of held back that eviction tide, but I'm not convinced we're out of the woods on that yet. And a majority of them lack a college degree, which in those industries would sort of be consistent. And then the thing that shocked me the most is that 4 in 10 of them were over the age of 44. So these are people who have been reliant on these service industry jobs in order to keep themselves viable. And when the pandemic hit, they probably became among the most vulnerable in the state. If we look forward and say of those, how many were already cost burdened before COVID hit, we get about 224,000 households. They have 278,000 workers. And you see the demographics of them here again, overwhelming, or 60-40 women, so more women than men. Much more high concentration of workers. We see the same profile with respect to a college degree. And 3 in 10 of those are housing vulnerable children. 110,000 children are living in these households that were already cost burdened prior to COVID, who are living with a single parent with the household income less than $75,000 and a parent who's reliant on a job in one of those adversely affected industries. So hopefully that gives you kind of a nice overview of sort of where we were pre-COVID, a little bit of information about what we think strategies are that are being used, particularly related to doubling up. A little bit of hope. Jen and I often feel like Dr. Doom when we do this because we're constantly highlighting problems. And just a bit of a snapshot so we don't forget about those who are probably still struggling with recovery from this pandemic. I get quite concerned that the headlines are about how we're largely recovered to pre-pandemic levels, but the headline numbers very often obfuscate what's going on below the headline numbers. So I wanted to make sure that you had a little bit of that background too, to see that there's folks who are likely very much still struggling to recover. The slide I have up now has links, and I think you'll have the slides, so you don't have to, feverishly write down. But all of these reports are available on our website. The Indie Dwell is most directly on the Lincoln Institute site, but you can also get to it from our CFC website. And I believe the link to the housing study that Jen and I did 3 or 4 years ago is there as well. And with that, I will leave us with just some information about how you can contact either Jen or me, and we'd be happy to talk further about our notion of the housing situation in the state. So thank you for inviting us to join you today.
Terrific. Well, thanks so much for that, Dr. Resnick. I'm going to open it up to questions that from our audience. If anyone has a question you'd like to pose, please put that in the chat, and we'll open that up and move on to our next speaker here in just a little bit. So,
and I have a little announcement, if I might. I just got a text from Jen that she has lost power at her house. So I believe that far be it for my connection in Morocco to be more stable than hers in Denver, but I think we've lost her.
Well, I'm glad we had both of you available just in that case.
I thought she was going to have to back me up.